Hi there, I'm Vinnue. My wife Natalie and I own and operate Russian River Brewing Company. We have two locations. First is in Santa Rosa, that opened in 2004. And we are in our Windsor facility right now, which opened in 2018. And this is our main production brewery. I've got a 75-barrel German brew house behind me throughout our operations here in the building. Now, Russian River Brewing Company didn't actually start in 2004. The brewery actually started back in 1997 out on the property of Corbel Champagne Cellars, which is a large sparkling wine producer here in Sonoma County. And the intent was for this winery to have a small brewing operation. We quickly started making IPAs and we're dry hopping our beers. And that was something I did previous to that at my first brewery, Blind Pig, which was down in Southern California. Today I'm going to be talking about hop creep. Now, hop creep is a phenomenon where there's a secondary fermentation that happens to a beer that's been dry hopped. Now, I'll be honest with you, I wish I was talking about a new dry hop technique or maybe how we optimize the brew house. But the fact is that hop creep is kind of a big issue in the beer industry right now. And not just for amateur brewers, for home brewers, but for professional commercial brewers alike. And it's something that I taste beers often from both amateur brewers and professional brewers. And I taste a little bit of diacetyl or that buttery note, which is a pretty good sign that if it's a dry hop beer, that the hop creep was happening there. So when we talk about hop creep is when you've got a beer that you've dry hopped, and in most cases it's going to be an India Pale Ale. And within the first 24 to 36 hours, there are enzymes in the hops, and those enzymes are going to break down the long chain sugars, and eventually the residual yeast is going to cause a secondary fermentation. Now, this is a topic that has really only been around in the modern era of brewing since 2016. But the fact is that it actually was written about back in the late 1800s. In modern times, researchers went back and academics went back and found that this was written about back in 1893 by two researchers, Brown and Morris. But instead of calling it hop creep, they had what I think is a better name for it. They called it the freshening power of dry hops. And what they meant by that was that when they dry hopped their India Pale Ales back in the late 1800s, and then they would ship the beer off and it would sit in the oak barrels for some time on the dry hops, they saw a secondary fermentation. And what we now call hop creep, they called the freshening power of dry hops. And what they meant by that was that that secondary fermentation actually dried the beer out a little bit more as it was on its voyage to wherever those barrels of India Pale Ale were going to be served. It made the beer drier. It just gave it a freshness and a lift, if you will, on body, mouthfeel, flavor. And then fast forward 50 or so years later, that research was reconfirmed by other researchers back in the day. And now that's in the, say, 1940s or so. And then fast forward to 2016, where we're at now, and it pops back up again. Why did it happen? Well, that's stuff that we can talk about throughout this video today. How did it come back? Why the reasons are, happening in the current brewing era that are causing hop creep again. Hop creep is the phenomenon where the enzymes that are in the hops, and these are the hops that are getting added to your beer in the form of a dry hop, those enzymes are actually breaking down the long chain sugars. So if you think about a regular fermentation, your beer goes through a fermentation, and as the yeast eats the sugar and the sugar turns to alcohol, that sugar content drops, the alcohol goes up, and in the end, you're going to be left with some amount of unfermentable sugar, and those are long chain dextrin sugars. And if you don't dry hop the beer, that is going to be what your residual sugar content is going to be. But if you add dry hops, and in a sizable quantity, those dry hops, those enzymes in the dry hops are going to break down those residual long chain sugars, make them short, basically turning them into simple sugars, And now the residual yeast that's left in the beer has the ability to cause a secondary fermentation. And that is what we call hop creep. So how does it actually work? Well, let's get a little bit deeper into it. So the same enzymes that trigger a mash, amyloglucosidase and alpha amylase, beta amylase, and limit dextrinase, those enzymes are the enzymes that we're finding on the hops. And those are the same enzymes that trigger a normal mash. So your mash, you have an enzymatic reaction where these enzymes cause the starches to convert to sugar, and then eventually the brewer will sparge that grain, that malt, and separate the sugars from the solids. And so that same enzymatic reaction is what we're seeing here. So it takes time, temperature, and concentration are three key factors to hop creep. And those are things that I will talk a little bit about through this presentation as well. And you will see how time, temperature, and concentration will all kind of get peppered in to the process, to the brewing process, and what makes hop creep and what makes hop creep happen. Why does hop creep make a difference? Well, there's four things that come to mind. First is safety. The second is tank time. The third is actually a legal reason. And then the fourth is potential off flavors. So let's start at the top with safety. So safety is always a big deal. It doesn't matter whether you're a home brewer or a professional brewer, you should always be thinking about safety. Safety goggles, eye protection, face protection when you're using chemicals and whatnot. Here, the reason why safety is an issue is that if you package your beer too soon and you have hop creep in your beer, meaning that you've dry hopped your beer and there's a secondary fermentation caused by these hops that you added, if you package that beer too soon, you might capture that excess CO2 from that secondary fermentation in your bottle or can, and you can potentially have an explosion or a bulging can or whatnot. So that's a huge, huge deal. And again, it doesn't matter if you're a home brewer or a professional brewer, you really need to be focused on that part of the potential issue of hop creep. Second is tank time. This is less to do with a home brewer, more to do with a professional brewer, that, you know, the longer it takes a beer to go through its process in the fermenter, that's less beers that we can turn through. We've actually had issues with Pliny the Elder and Blind Pig, our two primary beers here at Russian River Brewery. Pliny the Elder at one point was a 28-day beer. Now, when we came to our Windsor brewery facility here, my goal was to actually shorten the cycle time for Pliny down from 21 days to 18 days. And it actually ended up being reverse. Hop creep kept getting worse and worse, that we had to extend the tank time up to 28 days because we had to wait for that secondary fermentation to finish so that we wouldn't end up with any off flavors or any safety issues in the bottles of Pliny. So on a 28-day cycle, that meant that a tank could only be turned 13 times in a year. Well, we eventually started working out our issues with hop creep, and we got Pliny down to a 24-day cycle, and that puts us at about 15 turns on that tank. So we're getting better. And then from there, we've now got it down to 21 days. So I think we're at about 17 turns of a fermenter. So we'd still like to work our way down to 18 days. And that's something that we're still working on. And I think this is one of the reasons why, aside from some off flavors we get, is why we've made hop creep such an important part of the research that we do at Russian River Brewing Company. Again, extended tank time. If you're a home brewer, not a big deal. If your beer has to sit in your fermenter for an extra 5 or 10 days, it's really not the end of the world. But for a professional brewer, it could really be a huge dollar loss. So another reason why hop creep can be an issue is the legal reason. And we are governed by the TTB, the Tax and Trade Bureau, which is an arm of the federal government. And we have on a beer, whatever the stated alcohol is on the label. So let's use Pliny the Elder, for example. That's an 8% beer. We can go below or above that 8% by 0.3%. So Pliny could technically be as low as 7.7 or as high as 8.3 to stay legal with the TTB. Now, why this is an issue with hop creep is that oftentimes hop creep causing that secondary fermentation will make the beer drier, which also then makes a higher alcohol content and can potentially put us out of compliance with the federal government. So that's another reason that we really need to be focused on hop creep and try to come up with ways to correct it. And so in that case, we would actually lower our original gravity so that in the end, we still end at around 8% alcohol. Then there's just the flavor issue, that we can potentially have major flavor impacts because of hop creep. And what that main flavor impact is going to be diacetyl, but we could also throw our flavor profile of, again, using Pliny the Elder out of whack, and it won't be what we want because that batch of Pliny the Elder may be drier. If the beer is drier, that may accentuate the bitterness more, and the flavor might taste more bitter than what we actually want Pliny the Elder to be. So there's all kinds of flavor implications, but the biggest one is diacetyl. Now, when you go back and you think of a basic fermentation, you're gonna have a large amount of sugar at the beginning of fermentation. You add your yeast, and as the yeast eats the sugar and the sugar drops, you're gonna be creating alcohol. And so the sugar drops, alcohol goes up, and the byproduct is carbon dioxide. Now, one of the other things that happens in fermentation is that the yeast is gonna automatically make diacetyl. And so if you look at that curve, you're going to have the sugar dropping, the alcohol go up, and that first couple days of fermentation, you're gonna have this huge spike of diacetyl. And once it hits its peak a couple days into fermentation, it'll slowly bring itself down, and that diacetyl will reabsorb back into the yeast. And that's just the natural process that the yeast goes through with diacetyl. Now, if you take that same curve that I just looked at, specifically looking at the diacetyl, and you put that into a secondary fermentation that is quite possibly going to happen after you've made a large dry hop charge to the beer, you're going to see after about 24 hours, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending what your yeast is, you're going to see a spike in diacetyl, and there's going to be a spike in diacetyl from a secondary fermentation. One other thing to note is that after you make your dry hop addition, if it's a sizable addition of hops, you're actually also going to see a spike in sugar. It's not going to be a lot, but hops do contain a very small amount of sugar. So when you're making that large dry hop charge for your IPA, you're going to have an increase in sugar, and depending what yeast you use, you're going to potentially have an increase in diacetyl. Now, if you don't wait to drop the temperature of your tank, or you go to package that beer, albeit cans, bottles, or kegs, if that diacetyl level is above approximately 100 parts per billion, you might end up having a flavor impact on your beer, and thus your beer is going to have diacetyl. So one of the easiest ways to basically see if your beer is going through hop creep after you package it is that if you taste diacetyl, there's probably a pretty good chance that it's from hop creep. Now, you can pick up diacetyl if you have a Pediococcus bacterial infection in your beer, but that's probably not the case here. It most likely is the fact that hop creep has kind of reared its head, and it's what's causing the issue of the diacetyl. So there's many ways that you can reduce hop creep in your beer and the flavor effects of hop creep. There is no cure for hop creep, and you have to apply a lot of different techniques, and it might relate to what type of hops you add. It could be the type of hop products you add, or it could even be yeast related or yeast nutrient related. And those are all the things that I'm going to talk through now to give you an idea of what you can do as a brewer, both on the amateur level and on the professional level, to hopefully not necessarily get rid of hop creep, but at least reduce the impacts on your beer. So now we know what hop creep is and what causes hop creep. I want to talk through several different practices that you can put into play, both as an amateur brewer and a professional brewer to hopefully reduce the impact of hop creep on your beers. So the first thing we're going to look at is the dextrin malts, the unfermentable malts. So we're going to look at this kind of from two different vantage points. The first thing is that one thing you can do is actually lower your mash temperature. So if you're traditionally trying to make a beer with a lot of body, you're going to have, and let's assume you're doing a single temperature infusion mash, you're going to do a mash temperature that's probably higher in temperature, closer to 158, 159 Fahrenheit, if you're really trying to get a lot of body and mouthfeel and a lot of residual sugar. Well, the issue with hop creep is that if you have a lot of residual sugar in your beer, that residual sugar are unfermentable long chain sugars. And if you then go and dry hop your beer, you're going to cut those long chain sugars into short sugars, more simple sugars that the yeast that's in your beer with a dry hop can ferment. So one thing you can do is actually lower your mash temperature to make simple sugars, to make drier beer, and to compensate, you probably will want to lower your original gravity so that you still end up at the right alcohol content. Now, you might end up with a drier beer than you originally wanted, but that is just one of the side effects of hop creep. Another thing when we're talking about the malt, and specifically the dextrin malt, is to consider reducing or eliminating all the dextrin malt that you're using in your IPA. So that would be malt like Carapils, Carafoam, those types of malts that are leaving long chain sugars behind to help boost the mouthfeel. So that's another simple way. So we've cut out almost all of our dextrin malt, the unfermentable sugars from our recipes to aid in having less hop creep. One little trick you can do if you're making beer and you're finding that, you know, I've reduced my hop creep, but I still want to get a little bit higher finishing gravity. One little trick that we've fallen back on, and it's actually an old brewing technique that often gets forgotten, and that's your grist to water ratio. Don't forget that if you thicken up your grist, and you use less water when you're mashing your grain, you're actually going to have a more robust body and a higher residual sugar, and your terminal gravity should finish a little bit higher. And conversely, if you're trying to make a thinner beer, you can actually thin out your mash and cause the beer to be drier. That's something that we've done with our German brew house here, unrelated to hop creep, to try to adjust and optimize the finishing gravity so that we end up at a proper terminal gravity for all of our beers. So looking beyond the dextrin malts, let's move to yeast. So when I think about yeast and hop creep, the first thing I'm going to do is yeast selection. So certain yeast are more prone to hop creep. Unfortunately for us at Russian River Brewing Company, California ale yeast, 1056, or any variant of that often causes hop creep. So unfortunately, for those of you that use California ale yeast or 1056 or similar types of yeast, hop creep's probably going to be worse on your dry hop beers. It just is what it is. For us, we've been using it so long that we don't want to change our flavor profile of our beers, so we continue to use it and we work with it. Next thing you're going to do is just look at yeast health. Overall yeast health is one of the biggest things you can do to help mitigate and reduce hop creep. So if you're reusing the yeast from batch to batch, pull it as soon as possible, reuse it as soon as possible. If you're able to do cell counts and viability checks, make sure that your yeast, that you're pitching at good high cell counts and that you have a very high viability. For a home brewer, this might be the time to use dry yeast instead of liquid yeast. And the reason for that is that when you buy dry yeast, most of the prominent dry brewers yeast companies now will tell you that you don't need to aerate your wort. And in a lot of cases, you can just pitch it directly. You don't even have to proof the yeast. So this is giving you a head start on having really healthy yeast right from the get-go. And maybe you find that the dry yeast doesn't finish quite as well, and maybe the next time you have to add a little bit more yeast, and that's okay if that's what you need to do to get good healthy yeast. The final part of the yeast puzzle that I'm going to talk about is yeast health, but specifically relating to yeast nutrients. Now, Most commercial brewers will be adding zinc to their wort when they're making the yeast addition. The zinc is a nutrient that the yeast needs to go through its process of growing, respiring, doing all the things that yeast does, and in the end, just having a healthy fermentation. Now, the thing about zinc is that you're only looking for 0.15 parts per million. That's a pretty small amount. When I break that down into an actual volume, I'm going to use our pilot brewery, for example, here. That's a 6-barrel pilot brewery. And when we're adding zinc, the zinc addition is only 0.25 grams of zinc that we're adding. It ends up, I mean, I can almost count the number of granulars of zinc that I'm adding directly to the fermenter, depending on how we're adding the zinc. So if I translate that down to a 5 or 10 gallon homebrew batch, it's almost impossible to make that addition. So one suggestion I have is, if you're a home brewer, is instead of using zinc as a yeast nutrient, fall back on a proper yeast nutrient. For instance, Cervomyces or Yeast X, and there's many other brands out there that you can use. And that will have the zinc in it, along with some other nutrients that will not only aid in your fermentation and hopefully reduce your hop creep, but it'll make it a little bit easier to measure out as compared to commercial breweries that are actually just using zinc on its own. This next one isn't going to be relevant to any home brewer, and it's not even going to be relevant to most commercial brewers, but it's still worth bringing up because it is a way to remedy hop creep, and that's pasteurization. So I was on a panel for the Craft Brewers Conference last year, and there was a brewer on the panel with me from Australia, and he actually pasteurizes his what I'll call green beer, and then he dry hops it. So that pasteurization process will denature the enzymes that are on the hops that's helping cause hop creep. And that's a great way to positively end hop creep, but it's also a negative impact on flavor profile. So again, not something that I think you're going to be doing, but worth bringing up just to have it in the back of your mind. Next is going to be yeast dumps. So after the fermentation is complete, you want to get all the yeast, or as much of the yeast that settles into the cone of your tank, out of the fermenter and off the beer. Now, if you're a home brewer and you don't have a draft beer system, and meaning you don't have CO2, this is going to be pretty difficult, because if you're not using a cylindrical cone fermenter, you might not be able to rack the beer to another vessel. As a commercial brewer, almost all of us are using cone bottom tanks. So after the fermentation's done, we want to dump as much yeast off as possible. And the reason for this is that the less yeast that's in there, the less potential for fermentation after the enzymes have broken down some of those long chain sugars. So reducing the yeast load's a big deal. In our case, California ale yeast isn't the most flocculent yeast, so we end up with a lot of yeast still left in our beer, but certain English strains flocculate really well, and those probably will have less of an impact with hop creep because you're going to have less yeast in your beer. Now, as a home brewer, if you are able to purge another vessel and then rack from, say you're using a carboy and you don't have a cone bottom tank, you can purge that secondary vessel and you can rack from the first, your primary, to your secondary. You might want to consider doing that if you're going to have a heavy dry hop load. But don't do it if you don't have a way to purge that secondary vessel with CO2, because that will cause more damage. The oxidation that you get from that air contact will be worse than what you see from hop creep. One of the trends that a lot of commercial brewers have moved to in trying to deal with hop creep is to actually lower the temperature of their dry hop. So conventionally, American IPAs have been dry hopped at about 68 Fahrenheit, maybe a couple degrees lower, maybe a couple degrees more. And that's been pretty normal. But there's now a lot of breweries that dry hop at a much lower temperature, and this will aid in reducing hop creep. And the reason why is that if you bring the temperature down, depending on how cold you get, you can actually stop the enzymatic action that is happening, and just purely by making your beer cold when you dry hop. Now, if you have a beer that's existing, let's use Pliny the Elder again. This beer has a pretty long track record, and our consumers know exactly what it should taste like. And what we've found is that when we've tested dry hopping Pliny the Elder at lower temperatures, we've gone as low as 52 Fahrenheit up to 60 or 62. We see a totally different flavor profile. We don't get as much fruity notes. We don't get as much citrus notes. So for us, dry hopping cold doesn't work, but our trials have shown that you can significantly reduce the amount of enzymatic reaction that's going on just by lowering the temperature. So it's worth testing, especially if you're a commercial brewer and you're creating a new brand and there are no expectations like we have with Pliny the Elder. There's a product called alpha acetolactate decarboxylase. Say that 10 times over, it's a tongue twister. We actually call it ALDC for short. And ALDC won't stop the enzymatic reaction from happening, but it will eliminate or at least lessen the flavor profile of diacetyl. And this is something that a lot of commercial brewers are using to help remedy hop creep. Again, it's not going to get rid of or stop that enzymatic reaction. If you add ALDC to your beer, albeit on an amateur or a professional level, that enzymatic reaction is still going to happen. It's still going to be breaking down those long chain sugars, but you're going to have less of a flavor impact with diacetyl because the ALDC is blocking that flavor pathway. This is a great, great trick. It does add cost to your beer, but on a professional level, it's been a great way for us to reduce the impact of what diacetyl contributes. And the period of time that we have to wait for the diacetyl to reabsorb into the beer is much less when we're using ALDC. Now, even just a year, even 2 years ago, you probably couldn't find ALDC at your homebrew shop, but it's actually starting to pop up in homebrew shops now because homebrewers are affected by hop creep just as much as a commercial brewer is. So if your homebrew shop that you shop at doesn't stock ALDC, just ask them, because I'm pretty sure that one of their vendors that they're working with to purchase malt and hops and other ingredients are probably able to get a small container of ALDC and then break it down into smaller vials for you to use at home. So I can't believe I'm even going to suggest this one, but one way to remedy hop creep is to use less hops. Now, if you're making an IPA, that's kind of counterintuitive, especially at the hop loads that we're adding in, present era IPA production, not just here in America, but around the world. American IPAs are being emulated all over the world. So I just want to throw that out there, that one of the big contributors of hop creep is just the sheer volume of hops that we are adding. When I started homebrewing, I was 19 years old. It was 1989, and I was dry hopping what seemed like a lot. And then by 1994, I opened my first brewery, my first commercial brewery, Blind Pig, in Temecula, California. And our regular IPA was dry hopped at about a rate of 0.5 pound per barrel. And that's where I made the first double IPA, and that was a 1 pound per barrel dry hop. At the time, that was pretty revolutionary, and that was a pretty large quantity of dry hops to go into a dry hopped beer. In this day and age, that's just downright pedestrian, but in its time, that was a really big deal, and I never had issues with hop creep back then. Now, there's a lot of other reasons than just quantity of hops going into a fermenter. It's just worth noting that we're adding a lot more hops now than we did even 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago and beyond. So you can look at some different ways of dry hopping, or different hop products, I should say. And the first is, let me just compare dry hopping with whole cone hops, so flowers, versus pellets. And one of the things that we've found is that when you dry hop with a whole cone hop in its original state, you actually will get less hop creep than compared to a pellet. And the reason for that is that the hop processors up in the Northwest are processing the hops. When they're going to go from a whole cone to a pellet, they have to take this whole cone hop and they have to grind it up, pulverize it, put it through a hammer mill, and then they'll reform it in the shape of the hop pellet. And in doing so, they're crushing all of the green matter and all of the material to be able to then convert it into a pellet. And in doing so, they're making the enzymes, they're making those enzymes more readily available to come out and liberate those long chain sugars, turn them into short chain sugars, and your residual yeast will continue that fermentation. Now, it's really hard on a homebrew level, and it's just as hard on a professional level to dry hop with whole cone hops. So this isn't necessarily a practical practice that many breweries at any level can do, but it is worth noting that breweries that dry hop with whole cone hops typically see less hop creep than ones that use pellets. Another thing you can do is use extracts, or better yet, oils to dry hop with. Now, some breweries are opposed to this just because it's not as natural of a product. It's not a natural product, if you will, but it does work because those oils and extracts have far less or even none of the green matter, which is where we think the enzymes are residing that are helping contribute to hop creep. So hop oils have come a long way. Back when I started brewing professionally in the mid-90s, if I were to add a little hop oil to a beer, to me it tasted artificial and synthetic, but they have come a long ways, and it is worth noting that hop oils and extracts can contribute positively when you're trying to eliminate hop creep. Another practice that a lot of breweries are using are hop products that have been processed differently. So instead of taking the whole cone hop and converting it into a standard hop pellet that's called a T90 pellet, they're using what are technically considered a T45 pellet. The difference between a T90 pellet and a T45 pellet is that the T45 pellet has roughly 50% less of the green matter in that pellet. So it's been removed from hop material through the process of pelleting from a whole cone to a T45 pellet. A T45 pellet also goes by the name of Cryo. That's a branded type of T45 pellet from Yakima Chief hops. And several of the other hop purveyors also have their own version of T45 or Cryo. But in doing so, you've concentrated the hop oils and the alpha acids. So let's take Simcoe, for example, which is the hop that we use the most of at Russian River Brewery. If Simcoe is a 12 alpha acid in a T90 pellet, it'll end up being close to 23 or 24% alpha acid in a T45 or Cryo pellet. But it's also concentrated the oil content. What that does is it's allowing us to add 50% less hops. An example of a beer where we use all Cryo or T45 compared to a T90 pellet is our beer Row 2 Hill 56. Row 2 Hill 56 is named after the original location of the first ever Simcoe vine that was planted up in Yakima. And this would be obviously an experimental field. Eventually, Row 2 Hill 56 got an experimental number, YCR 014, and from there it got named Simcoe. Now, when we used to make Row 2 Hill 56, our 100% Simcoe beer, it was 100% T90 pellets, not just on the hot side in the kettle, but in the dry hop as well. We can take that dry hop process, and formerly it was just under 2 pounds per barrel when it was a T90 pellet. When we switched to Cryo, we were able to cut that hop load in half. So instead of being just under 2 pounds per barrel with T90s to just under 1 pound per barrel. And in doing so, we reduced our green matter pretty significantly And it's that green matter where a lot of those enzymes reside that are helping cause hop creep. And by reducing that green matter and reducing that enzymatic reaction, we lowered the hop creep. There was a time when row 2 Hill 56 on average was taking 10 days to dry hop. That's 10 days from the day that we added the dry hops to when we finished the dry hop, meaning we centrifuged the beer off the dry hops in the tank or off the yeast in the tank. When we started adding cryo, we were able to shave 3 days off that 10 days and go from 10 to 7 days. And we're still working to cut that time even more. But it's a perfect example of how these special cryo T45 type hop pellets can help reduce hop creep. Now, it should be noted that a lot of craft brewers will dry hop with both cryo or a T45 pellet and T90 pellets. And the reason for that is that they feel like they get a better depth of aroma and flavor by having some T90 pellets. What I love about cryo and T45 pellets is that it leaves a more true to type aroma and flavor profile in those hops. So we use a lot of cryo in our dry hopping at Russian River Brewing Company, not just to help reduce hop creep, but also because we really like the flavor and aroma profile that it leaves behind. A practice that has been around for years in the beer industry, but has really been accelerated, especially through these past handful of years where dry hop loads has become more and more, is the practice of mixing your dry hops. So what I mean by that is the brewer, albeit a commercial or an amateur brewer, will add dry hops to their vessel. Could be a bucket, a carboy, or a smaller big tank. And they're gonna mix those dry hops. And the reason for this is that it's gonna help accelerate those enzymes. And those enzymes, if you can get those enzymes to get working faster, you can actually make the hop creep process move along much quicker as well. And so when I think about mixing hops, there's a couple ways you can do it. And some of these are only going to apply to a commercial brewer, but some of them you can also do as a home brewer. Now, the first thing when I think about mixing hops is we can add hops to the fermentation only 2 or 3 days into the fermentation. And if you go back to the basic process of fermentation, it's going to be moving. I think back to the old days of when I homebrewed in a carboy and I can actually see the beer fermenting and turning. And so we make a couple beers that we do mid-fermentation dry hops. One is double dry hop Pliny the Elder, and the second is our hazy IPA Mind Circus. Both of those beers get their dry hops 3 days into the fermentation process. I like making a mid-fermentation dry hop, not only because we're seeing some biotransformation, the interaction between the yeast and the hops, but it's also starting that hop creep process. And interestingly, we've seen as much as up to a 3/4 of a Plato drop just in 24 hours of a fermentation mixing. And that's pretty staggering drop of a beer that's been dry hopped. And that was on a beer, Apical Dominance, that it was already done fermentation. It wasn't even a mid-fermentation dry hop. We finished the fermentation and then we added the dry hops and we mixed the tank for 24 hours. And 24 hours later, we saw almost a 3/4 of a Plato drop in the gravity of the beer. So that's pretty significant. Another beer that I think about that we make that has a really heavy hop load, close to 4 pounds per barrel, is Happy Hops. Now, Happy Hops is my answer to the hazy IPA. I jokingly call it our not so hazy IPA. I made it long before we made Mind Circus, and it was really a challenge to myself to see if I could make an IPA that had those really nice juicy notes like a hazy IPA has, but having a clear look to the beer. And at those hop loads, we will add the hops to the tank and we'll mix it for 24 to 48 hours. Now, we have a special way of mixing our beers that when we dry hop. When I designed the tanks here at our Windsor facility, I had an extra port added to the back of the tanks, and we have a portable tank mixer that we can connect into the tank. We can push the rod in, and at the end of the rod, and that goes through a ball valve, not a butterfly valve, and the end of the rod has an impeller that opens up. It's stainless steel, and then we can plug it in, turn it on, and we can turn the tank just by this mixer, and we can move that mixer from tank to tank to tank. Most breweries don't have the ability to do this, so they mix by either bubbling CO2 through the bottom of the tank, or they connect a pump and come out of the racking arm and then go into the bottom of the tank, and that's how they mix the tank. Both those methods work well. I prefer the method that we use with the Guth tank mixer because, one, when you're bubbling CO2 through, you're potentially stripping some of those super delicate volatile hop oils that you're trying to capture to be in the aroma of your beer. And I don't necessarily like the pump because if your pump happens to have a bad pump seal, you may, through the Venturi effect, be sucking in air as you're mixing the tank. So again, both methods work, but I much prefer the way that we do it. Once your dry hops are in the tank, one of the practices that we have seen that have greatly reduced the amount of time that our beer on dry hops has to sit in the fermenter after the dry hops have been added is to actually dump the cone of the tank 24 to 72 hours after you've added the dry hops. And this is regardless of if you are mixing the tank or you're not mixing the tank. Now, if you're not mixing the tank, you might want to let them sit a little bit longer because you're not going to get the oils extracted as fast if you don't have some sort of mechanism to mix the tank. And so for us, when we're mixing a tank, we'll dump the cone at 24 to 48 hours after the dry hop. Now again, our tanks have a cylindroconical cone. They have a cone bottom to them. So as the hops travel through, you have what's called travel time, or what I call travel time. And that travel time is the contact time with the interaction between the hops and the beer. And the reason for this is that the longer those dry hops stay in contact with your beer, the more enzymatic reaction is happening. And those enzymes in your hops are going to continue to break down the long chain sugars and thus enable the yeast to continue a secondary fermentation. And thus it's going to keep kicking out diacetyl. And you're going to have to wait a longer period of time for that diacetyl to reduce to get below the threshold to where you can't smell or taste it in your beer. So this is really important. I'd say of everything we've done, aside from yeast health at Russian River Brewing Company, this is the one practice that has really made our beers better and has made hop creep less of an issue. And when I say it makes beer better, the reason for that is that Tom Shellhammer and some of his grad students at Oregon State University over the years have researched hops, and they've determined that you get everything out of your hops from as little as 4 hours for certain hop compounds and up to 48 hours. Anything after 48 hours, you're adding a negative quality to your beer because the oils that you've extracted are now in the beer that you hope will become the aroma can actually reabsorb back into those hops that are now sitting at the bottom of your tank. So that's just another reason why you want to get your beer off the dry hops after 24 to 72 hours, depending on if you're mixing or not. Now let's talk about if you're a home brewer. If you're a home brewer and you don't have the ability to dump the cone because maybe you're fermenting in a bucket or a carboy, now you need to ask yourself, do you have a CO2 source? If you can purge a vessel, a secondary or third vessel, if you've already done one transfer already, you should at least consider doing that to rack your beer off those hops. And then at least that enzymatic reaction isn't just continuing to happen. Now, hop creep will most likely still continue on depending on what yeast you use, but just being off the hops will make that process a little bit easier and a little bit shorter. Not all of the experiments that we've done at Russian River Brewing Company to help mitigate and reduce hop creep have worked. So I'm going to talk about a couple of them now. Earlier, I talked a little bit about cryo. Cryo being a hop product from Yakima Chief, where they reduce the green matter by about 50%, roughly. Now, the leftover product of cryo is a hop product that they call American Noble. So American Noble ends up being a concentrated version of the green matter that they removed from the cryo. So I had this harebrained idea. What if we throw the American Noble into the mash tun and start that, or at least carry on that enzymatic reaction just a little bit earlier in the process? And let's see what we can do. So we added, I think, about 1 pound per barrel is what it worked out to be of American Noble to the mash tun, with the idea that not only would the natural enzymatic reaction happen between the malts and the water and the heat, but this concentrated enzymes in the American Noble might do a little more work, thus creating some more fermentable sugars, and down the line we wouldn't have as big of an issue with hop creep. Well, it worked a little bit, and it was a better theory than actual practice. So this was one that definitely failed. It's not something that we ever carried on after a handful of experiments at our smaller brew pub in Santa Rosa. Another experiment that we did using American Noble was, okay, let's think about what American Noble is. It's concentrated enzymes in the green matter of the hops. Well, what if we added a super small, minimal amount of American Noble at the beginning of the fermentation? Literally, when we pitch the yeast, let's also pitch some American Noble. And we tested it at all different levels, as low as 0.1 pound of American Noble hops per barrel of beer. So overall, pretty small amount of dry hops going in the form of American Noble. And the idea was that if we add these early on in the dry hop process, right at the beginning of fermentation, that would actually start that enzymatic breakdown of the long chain sugars by those enzymes in the American Noble. So we did actually see an improvement in our hop creep, but even at 1/10 of a pound per barrel, we were not able to collect that yeast and reuse it and do a serial pitch on a future batch of beer like we do with many of our fermentations, unless we're making a mid-fermentation hop addition. So again, another failure for us, because we need to be able to reuse our yeast over and over again. And truth be told, the reduction that we saw in the enzymes, or at least the enzymatic action that we saw when we added them, it didn't move the needle enough to make us really want to pursue this any further. So adding the American Noble at the beginning of the fermentation was another experiment that was really fun to try, but just didn't pan out. So a couple of experiments that we've done that have worked is the first being with flash kilned hops, and the second is actually going old school and actually using higher kiln temperature hops. So let's start with the flash kilned hops. So flash kilned is actually an idea that Pat Smith from Tributary Farms up in the Yakima Valley came up with. And what it is, and what his idea was to take the hops, doesn't matter what variety they are, and most hops now are kilned at about 130 degree Fahrenheit temperature. So his idea was, when the hops make it to the kiln bed, to actually take the temperature up to about 155 or 160 degrees and hold it there for 5 minutes. And the idea is to denature, not necessarily all of the enzymes in the hops, but denature them at least a little bit, so that downstream, when the brewer is using these flash kilned hops, they have less of an impact on the long chain sugars that are in the beer at the end of fermentation. So we created the beer Citra Flash Mob Pale Ale. Citra Flash Mob is 100% Citra IPA, and the idea was to build a beer around the concept of flash kilned hops. And in doing so, we use regular T90 pellets on the hot side, but when we're dry hopping, we're using these specially flash kilned hops from tributary farms. And it actually has worked. Just like all the things that I've talked about today, all the different remedies for hop creep, there is no one silver bullet that's gonna technically get rid of hop creep, but it's one tool that you can have in your toolkit to hopefully reduce the effects of hop creep on your beer. And so you're not gonna necessarily see flash kilned hops out in your homebrew store for the homebrewers that are watching just quite yet. This is still very much in the experimental phase in the professional commercial hop industry. The next experiment after flash kiln hops that we've been working on for 3 years now at Russian River Brewing Company is actually taking the kiln temperature of the hops back up to a temperature that almost all hops used to be kilned at in the old days. So formerly, and I'm gonna say before 10 or 12 years ago, hops were kilned at 145 degree Fahrenheit or even higher temperature for that matter. And this is definitely one of the reasons that I believe why hop creep has reared its head and has become an issue over the past decade or so. And that's because hops are kilned at a lower temperature. We're a member of the Hop Quality Group. And the Hop Quality Group is an organization that's kind of a liaison between hop growers and brewers. And we try to act as a conduit of information so that growers can learn about what we're looking for in hops and vice versa. We can take what growers have to deal with and take that back to brewers, and hopefully we can all work together so in the end we all have better, higher quality hops. And something that the Hop Quality Group advocated for very early on was a lower kiln temperature. And a little over a decade later, almost all farms in the Northwest are using a lower kiln temperature. Some kilning as low as 125 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you compare that to 145, 20 degrees is a huge swing. And although we're not denaturing all of the enzymes at 145, we know we're denaturing more than at that lower temperature of 125 or 130. Because we buy about 50% of our hops direct from growers, that means we're buying hops direct from the grower instead of through a broker. We have the ability to work directly with the grower and say, you know what, I will commit to buying this lot of hops, but can you kiln it at a higher kiln temperature? So we've had Cascade, Centennial, Simcoe, Amarillo, and probably a couple more varieties kilned at a higher temperature. So we've tried to make up the entire dry hop recipe for Pliny the Elder in high kiln temperature hops so that we can do kiln trials and do brewing trials with these high kiln hops. And we'll do comparative brews where we're at 130 kiln temperature dry hops and 145 Fahrenheit kiln temperature dry hops. And what we found is that we can reduce the effects of hop creep by using 145 degree temperature hops. And so that's a good thing, but it does have some drawbacks. The first is that we've pretty much eliminated hop selection. Hop selection is the practice where brewers flock to the Northwest every year and they get to go to the different brokers and on occasion farms and select the hops that they're going to use for the following brewing season. So if we're going to commit to a higher kiln temperature hop, that means that we need to commit to the specific field of hops or lot of hops ahead of time, because it might be that the hop grower or broker can't sell those hops after because maybe the other brewers don't want that higher kiln temperature hop. But we've committed to it because we've been doing hop selection for so many years that many of our hop partners up in the Northwest know exactly the type of Simcoe, Amarillo, Cascade, or whatever the variety is that we're going to be selecting. So that's why this experiment has worked for us. We've done some different taste trials with it. There's been some universities have done some taste trials with this. We've done them internally. We've had some hop scientists also taste both the regular low kilned hops and the high kiln hops. And interestingly, in most of the cases, the tasting panel couldn't decide which one they liked better, or ironically, they actually liked the high kiln a little bit more. But I will say, for me personally, I like the high kiln hops early on because it still had the nice fruity and citrus notes in Pliny the Elder. That's what we were testing. But after a few weeks, those fruity and citrus notes dropped off much faster than the lower kiln temperature hops, which held that fruity and citrus note much longer. And those fruity and citrus notes in the 145 temperature kiln hops went to more herbal notes, and I didn't like that quite as much as the beer aged out. There wasn't anything wrong with the beer, but it didn't stay true to type to Pliny the Elder. So this is something that we still aren't sure if we're going to continue to go down this road or if we're going to just go back to 130 Fahrenheit for everything we do and look for other ways to remedy and reduce hop creep at Russian River Brewing Company. The last two topics that I want to talk about in ways to remedy or reduce hop creep relate to timing. So the first is just waiting out hop creep. And this is what we've done for a long time and we continue to do as we work through different practices that we can apply to the brewing process. And so waiting it out, what I mean is you add your dry hops, we dump the cone after 24 to 72 hours, and we've added ALDC to the beer to help eliminate some of that diacetyl aroma and flavor. And then we just let the beer sit and we wait it out. And there's a few things you can do to test the beer if this is how you're going to deal with hop creep. And the first is basically to heat up a sample. In our lab, we have a little heating block that also can mix. And so we'll take the beer sample up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and then from there, we'll pull the sample, let it cool down, and we'll smell it against a sample that wasn't heated up. And if in the sample that was heated up, if you smell butter, butterscotch, movie theater, buttered popcorn, that's the diacetyl. And that is a good sign that you still have hop creep active going on in that beer sample. And so you would want to wait another day or two before you take a sample again and run that same test. There's a much fancier and more expensive way to do it, and that's to buy a piece of lab equipment called a gas chromatograph. And a gas chromatograph, or what we call GC for short, is a very expensive piece of equipment. I think baseline it's $70,000, somewhere in there, and they only get more expensive from there. And the gas chromatograph, or GC, can actually measure the level of diacetyl in parts per billion. And this is another method that we use at Russian River Brewing Company. We thought that putting a number on the diacetyl that's being created from the hop creep was so important that we invest in this piece of equipment. Now, this piece of equipment doesn't necessarily make us money, but I look at it as it kind of saves our reputation. Because if we were to put a beer out that had hop creep or hadn't finished hop creep and the diacetyl was still there, the customer gets the beer, they drink it and they say, wow, that doesn't taste like Pliny the Elder. Well, that's our reputation on the line now. We spent a large amount of money to be able to quantify the level of diacetyl in our beer from hop creep. And we can also use it for our non-dry hop beers also. Now, one of the things that gets difficult when you do the forced diacetyl test where you heat the sample up and cool it down, as I just mentioned, was that when you get to the point where there's less and less diacetyl, when you smell that heated sample, you've also just cooked the beer and oxidized it when you heated it up. And it gets harder and harder, at least for me, to differentiate between cooked oxidized beer and the buttery note. The lines become very blurred when the diacetyl gets really low. So I really like having the GC and being able to quantify that number. So we would love to be down in the 50 to 60s. Often we're in 70 to 80 total diacetyl or VDK, but our top limit is going to be about 90 or 100 parts per billion diacetyl in that VDK test via our GC. If it's anything above 100, we'll let that beer ride out and we will wait until the number gets low enough. Now, the final method that you can use to test for the diacetyl, the result of hop creep, is just simply by taking a gravity reading. And this is the best way for a home brewer who certainly doesn't have a GC and maybe doesn't want to go to the trouble of heating a sample up, waiting for it to cool down, smelling it, and using that process. So what you can do is you can take a gravity of your beer, and this works for amateur and professional brewers alike. Take a sample of your beer, take a gravity of it before you add the dry hops. It's absolutely critical that you have a baseline at the beginning of the dry hop process before the dry hops go in. So let's just assume that you take that sample and the beer is at 3 Plato, and then you add the dry hops. And a few days later, you remove the dry hops and the hop creep continues on. The fermentation is very slow, but it's happening. And you take a gravity again, and now you're down from 3 Plato, you're at 2.75. And you say, okay, well, it moved from originally from that 3 Plato. So now I'm going to wait a couple more days. I'm going to take another gravity. Let's say it's down to 2.5 Plato. You say, okay, well, it's continued to move. Hop creep is still happening. So I don't want to rack that beer or drop the temperature yet because we want that hop creep to finish. Then you come back another day or two later and you take the gravity and it's still at 2.5 Plato. Our rule at Russian River, if we're using this method, is if we can go 2 days in a row without a gravity change, so in this case, we've locked in at 2.5 Plato for 2 days in a row or more, then we know that hop creep has stopped, because that's pretty simple. That's just your fermentation not continuing on, just as if you were at the end of your primary fermentation before the dry hops go in. You know you're done with primary fermentation when the gravity doesn't drop anymore. So that same technique will work and can be applied here when you are waiting out hop creep. Now, the last method that I'll talk about, ways to remedy and reduce hop creep, is just the opposite of waiting it out. And this one is just don't let hop creep happen in the first place. And there's a lot of breweries in America that are doing this method. And this is how breweries have really shortened down their tank time, is just to not let hop creep happen in the first place. And they're really relying on that research that Tom Shellhammer and his grad students have done at Oregon State University, where you are going to get everything out of the hops within 4 to 48 hours. And so in this method, you'll add the dry hops to your beer. And if you're going to do this method, you typically want to be mixing the hops so that you can get the extraction of the oils out of the hops and into the beer as quick as possible. And so you add the hops, we turn the mixer on, we mix for 24 to 48 hours, depending on what beer it is. Here at Russian River, we're only mixing for 24 hours, and then we're going to drop the temperature, and we're going to immediately stop that enzymatic reaction from happening, or if it's already started, it's going to stop it in the middle of the enzymatic reaction. Now, the downside and the caveat that I need to give you is that if your diacetyl has increased dramatically during that period, you might have gone over the 100 part per billion level that is the level that most humans can detect or not detect diacetyl at. And so that's why having really strong lab practices and really good science behind how you're going to test your beer for diacetyl, it really comes into play. And so we are testing that method right now. And when you're looking at hop creep, this video presentation I'm giving today is a bit of a snapshot. It's a moment in time of what is happening in the beer world with hop creep. There is so much research going on, both at the brewery level and at the academic level, not just in America, but worldwide when it relates to hop creep. And so for us at Russian River Brewery, we're kind of moving more in the direction of, let's try to keep our hops low kilned, 125, 130, so that we get the more bright, hop aromas, because the reason why we want a lower kiln temperature is that when we raise the kiln temperature, yes, we are denaturing some of those enzymes in the hops that will end up going into our dry hop recipe, but those warmer kiln temperatures are also getting rid of or blowing off a lot more of those super delicate, volatile hop oils that we really want. You know, obviously we want that. We want those hop oils, as much of those as possible, to end up in the beer that our consumers are drinking. So as I look forward to how we are going to move forward with kiln temperature, I'm still not 100% sure if we're going to keep experimenting with higher kiln temperatures at 145, or if we'll just go back to 130 Fahrenheit and look to other methods, such as trying not to even let hop creep start in the first place. That's where I'm thinking we're going to be going, but who knows? Experimentation has always been a part of what Russian River Brewing Company is about. A few more things when I look at hop creep that we have to deal with at Russian River Brewing Company is mainly the one I'm thinking of the most is the adjustment of the recipe. And that's because when we started out, we didn't have much hop creep, but as hop creep became more of an issue, we had to adjust our recipe. We had to adjust the malt bill, less dextrin malt. We had to adjust the mash temperature just to be able to accommodate the hop creep so that in the end, Pliny the Elder was at 8% alcohol, or Blind Pig was at 6.25% alcohol. And every once in a while, we have batches, dry hopped batches of Blind Pig or Pliny the Elder or any of our other dry hop beers. The hop creep just doesn't happen, and we don't know why. Most of the time, it's very predictable, and we've adjusted recipes for hop creep, but there is that one random batch that pops up every once in a while, and we don't know, why or how the beer didn't finish fermenting via the hop creep secondary fermentation. When that happens, it really depends to what degree that fermentation didn't complete. If it's a small amount, we're probably okay. But if it's a large amount, it might put us out of spec from a legal TTB standpoint, and we potentially have to blend those batches away so that ultimately we're releasing beer that is, one, within spec with the TTB, but also, and probably more important, is that we put a beer out that tastes just like the last batch of Pliny the Elder and the batch before that. And in short, Pliny the Elder, that our consumer knows and trusts when they buy that beer, that it's going to taste the same every time. There's a couple other things that I always think about that, okay, well, what can we do? What are a couple other avenues that we can take to maybe potentially reduce hop creep? What are other practices that are going on in the industry that may also be affecting hop creep? And the first of those is, we could potentially add some enzymes to the mash to break down those long chain sugars earlier on in the process, and then end up with a more fermentable base beer. And then when we make our dry hop addition, there just isn't as many or any long chain sugars left for the enzymes in the dry hops to then break down the long chain sugars and thus have a secondary fermentation via the remaining yeast. But for me, that doesn't really work for us because we want some degree of residual sugar in our beer to add body and mouthfeel. So, going to a quote unquote, brute IPA style beer for all of our IPAs isn't really a road that we want to go down. One area that I think about a lot is after the hops have been processed, and I talked about kiln temperatures, how that can potentially affect the overall hop creep and the variability of it, but it's pelleting. So when hops get converted from whole cone to pellets, they get heated up. There's a heating process there. And we know for a fact that compared to even 10 years ago, they are pelleting hops at a lower temperature now than they did previously 10 years ago. So that's another area that might potentially affect hop creep and how active the enzymes are in the hops. Again, it's a bit like the difference between 145 degree Fahrenheit kiln temperature and 130 degree Fahrenheit kiln temperature. You know, we definitely will get better aromas off that 130 degree Fahrenheit kiln temperature, and kind of the same thing here. We want our hops pelleted at low enough or a lower temperature, whatever the lowest temperature that the hop purveyors can pelletize at, while still delivering us a quality hop pellet, whether it's a T45 or a T90 pellet. But it is worth noting, and just for you to have in the back of your mind, that quite possibly maybe a part of this hop creep puzzle is even beyond the kiln temperature, and maybe we need to also look at the pelleting temperature as well, and that's just a contribution to hop creep. You know, I get asked a lot, so what causes hop creep? What do you think? If you could say one thing that's causing hop creep more than anything else, I'd say this. It's that we're adding a whole lot more hops in our dry hop bills compared to even 5 or 10 years ago. You know, when I started Blind Pig, a half to 1 pound per barrel was a very large amount of dry hops to be adding to a beer. And now, you know, we dry hop Blind Pig at 1 pound per barrel, and it's almost laughable compared to some of the, you know, numbers that we're at, 4 or 5 pounds per barrel. I have friends in the industry that are dry hopping at even higher dry hop rates than that. So, you know, at the end of the day, we're adding more green matter, more hops. In doing so, we're adding more enzymes, and adding those additional enzymes via the large quantity of hops. We are also contributing to hop creep, and we're adding a little more sugar as well. And so at the end of the day, you know, the consumer wants a great over-the-top beautiful expression of hops, and that comes from dry hopping at 2 pounds per barrel or more, and we just need to figure out ways to work around it. I hope that all of these different ideas that I've thrown at you today are helpful, and that they can help you make better beer, and hopefully in the end reduce hop creep, and hopefully you just have a little better understanding of what hop creep is and how it affects your beer, whether it be home brewing or commercial brewing.